My son-in-law told me I wasn't welcome at his father's retirement gala. It's a professional event, Robert, he said. Investors will be there. We can't have you wandering around asking people if they need their pipes checked. So I spent that Saturday night alone in my workshop. But 3 weeks later, my phone rang at midnight. My daughter's voice was shaking. Dad, why is Marcus's name on every news channel in the state? I'm Robert Callahan, 68 years old, and I've spent most of my life being underestimated by people who never bothered to ask a single question about who I actually was. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you've ever had family look right through you like you were furniture, hit that like button because this one's for you. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon in early October, right around 4 o'clock. I remember because I was out in the garage, running my hand along the frame of a 1967 Mustang I'd been restoring for going on 2 years now, and my phone buzzed against the workbench hard enough to rattle a socket wrench onto the concrete floor. It was my daughter, Claire. Claire didn't call to chat. She never had, not really, not since she married Marcus Whitfield 6 years ago. When my phone lit up with her name, it usually meant she needed something, or she was calling on behalf of somebody who needed something. And this time, it was Marcus's father, Ellis Whitfield, a man I'd met exactly 4 times in 6 years, and who'd never once remembered my name correctly. Dad, hi, Claire said, and there was that clipped, hurried tone in her voice, the one she used when she was reciting a script somebody else had handed her. So, listen, Ellis's retirement gala is coming up on the 25th. It's a really big deal. The whole firm is going to be there. Half the city council, some serious investors Marcus has been courting for the Riverside project. Sounds like quite the evening, I said, wiping grease off my fingers with a rag, already knowing where this was headed. It is. It's huge for Marcus. And, she paused. I could hear her breathing change, the way it always did right before she said something she didn't want to say. We think it's probably best if you don't come this time. I set the rag down on the workbench very carefully. Why is that? It's not personal, Dad. It's a very specific crowd. Old money, corporate types, people Marcus needs to impress. And you know how you get. You'll end up in a corner talking to somebody's husband about carburetors or plumbing or whatever, and Marcus is worried it'll look. She stopped herself, but I finished the sentence in my head before she found a gentler way to say it. It'll look like what it is. It'll look like his wife's father spent 40 years running a small mechanical contracting business instead of sitting on some board somewhere. I understand, I said, keeping my voice level, because I had learned a long time ago that raising your voice with Claire when Marcus had already made up her mind was like shouting into a well. The only thing that came back was your own echo. You're not mad? Why would I be mad? I've got a car to finish. I hung up before she could hear whatever might have leaked into my voice if I'd stayed on that line 1 second longer. The garage was quiet after that, just the hum of the shop lights and the tick of the Mustang's engine cooling from the hour I'd spent under the hood. I stood there for a long while, looking at my own hands, thick and scarred and permanently stained at the knuckles no matter how hard I scrubbed them. And I thought about the last 6 years. Ever since Claire married into the Whitfield family, I had watched myself slowly get edited out of her life, one holiday at a time, one gathering at a time, replaced by a version of her father that didn't embarrass anybody at a cocktail party. They believed they knew exactly who I was. A retired tradesman. A man who'd spent his life with his hands in engines and pipe fittings, driving a 12-year-old pickup truck, living alone in the same modest Rambler I'd bought back in 1988 with Claire's mother, God rest her. They saw the coveralls and the calloused hands, and they stopped looking. Nobody in the Whitfield family had ever asked me a single question about the 30 years I'd spent before I opened that little contracting shop. Nobody had ever asked what I did in my 20s and 30s, back when I wore a very different uniform. I walked into the house, past the kitchen where Diane's photograph still sat on the windowsill 11 years after we lost her, and down the hallway to the room Claire used to call Dad's boring office when she was a little girl, because to her it had only ever contained filing cabinets and an old roll-top desk. What she never knew, what nobody in that family had ever bothered to find out, was that behind the false back panel of that roll-top desk sat a safe, and inside that safe sat the only physical proof of the life I'd lived before I became, in their eyes, nothing more than a man who fixed things for a living. I spent 11 years as a federal financial crimes investigator before I ever touched a wrench for money. I built my second career, the plumbing and mechanical contracting business, specifically because it let me disappear. After the things I'd seen chasing money launderers and shell company operators across 3 continents, after testifying in trials that put men away for decades, after watching colleagues get quietly threatened for digging too deep into the wrong construction financing scheme, I wanted a life where nobody looked at me twice. A man in coveralls with grease under his nails is invisible in this country. That invisibility had been a gift for 22 years. Now, sitting in the quiet of that little office with my daughter's rejection still ringing in my ears, I understood it might finally be useful again. I hadn't planned on doing anything with that old life. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't angry enough that Thursday afternoon to go looking for a reason to hurt anybody. I was just a man nursing a bruise, same as any father would be, sitting quietly with his own thoughts. It was what happened 4 days later that changed everything. Claire came by that following Monday to drop off a box of Diane's old recipe cards she'd finally decided to go through. And while she was in the kitchen, her phone rang, and she stepped into the hallway to take it, and in the process, she left a folder sitting open on my kitchen table. It wasn't intentional carelessness on her part. She trusted me the way you trust furniture, the way you trust something that's simply always been there and never asked questions. The folder had the Whitfield Development letterhead on it, and sitting right on top was a financing summary for something called the Riverside Landing Project, the very development Marcus had been courting investors for at his father's gala. I wasn't trying to pry. I want to be clear about that too. But 22 years of training doesn't just switch off because you spent the following 2 decades sweating over furnace repairs. My eyes caught 3 numbers on that page before I even registered. I was reading it, and something in the back of my skull, some old dormant alarm bell, started ringing. The projected construction costs were listed at 1 figure. The bond insurance valuation, listed 2 lines below it, was based on an entirely different, much higher figure. And beneath that, in smaller print, was a reference to a materials procurement subsidiary I'd never heard of, something called Brackenfield Supply Partners, LLC. Claire came back into the kitchen, scooped up the folder without noticing anything, apologized for the phone call, and left 20 minutes later with a hug and a promise to call me before the gala, which we both knew was really an apology dressed up as a courtesy. But I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after she'd gone, staring at nothing, because I'd seen that particular pattern before. Inflated bond valuations. A materials subsidiary with a name that sounded invented, because it probably was. It was the exact architecture of a scheme I'd spent the better part of my federal career learning to recognize, the kind of financing fraud that gets built specifically so a project can attract more investor capital than the actual construction ever justifies, with the difference quietly siphoned off before the concrete ever gets poured. That night, I went back to the false panel behind the roll-top desk. I hadn't opened that safe in almost 15 years. Inside were 3 things: my old federal credentials, long since deactivated but never destroyed, a small hard drive containing case files I probably wasn't technically allowed to still possess, and a business card, slightly yellowed at the corners, for a woman named Teresa Mbeki, who had been my partner on my very last major case before I walked away from that life. Last I'd heard, Teresa had risen through the ranks and was now running financial crimes enforcement for the entire regional office. I did not call her that night. I told myself I needed more than a hunch and a page glimpsed over somebody's shoulder. So the next morning, instead of heading into my own small shop, I drove 40 minutes to the county records office and requested the public filings on Riverside Landing, the ones any citizen has a right to see. What I found there did not put my suspicions to rest. It confirmed every one of them, and then it showed me something worse. Riverside Landing was being marketed to investors as a luxury, mixed-use riverside development, 42 stories, with the structural and safety compliance paperwork all signed off by the city. But the permitted materials specifications on file, cross-referenced against the procurement invoices Brackenfield Supply Partners had submitted for reimbursement, showed a gap that made my stomach drop the way it hadn't dropped in over 20 years. They were billing investors in the city for 1 grade of structural steel and seismic reinforcement hardware, and quietly substituting a cheaper, decertified alternative sourced through Brackenfield, whose only listed officer, according to the state business registry, was a shell entity registered to a P.O. box in a state 3,000 miles away. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time. The old part of me, the part that had spent 11 years learning exactly how these operations worked, understood immediately what I was looking at. This wasn't simple corner cutting. This was a deliberate, structured fraud, layered specifically to survive a surface-level audit, and it meant that somewhere down the line, when that building was full of families and offices and elderly residents on the upper floors enjoying the river view they'd paid a premium for, the actual structural integrity of that tower would depend on materials that had never been certified to hold that kind of weight under real stress. The personal sting of not being invited to a retirement party had evaporated completely. This was no longer about my daughter's embarrassment or Marcus's ambition. This was 42 stories of potential catastrophe with my own granddaughter's future father-in-law's name on the marketing brochure and my own daughter's husband as the lead developer signing off on every certification. I drove home and I called Teresa and Becky for the first time in 15 years. She picked up on the third ring, and when I said my name, there was a pause, and then she laughed, warm and surprised. "Robert Callahan, I heard you went and became a plumber. Furnace and pipe work mostly," I said. "But Teresa, I need you to look at something, and I need you to trust me that I'm not calling you for old time's sake." The warmth in her voice shifted immediately into something focused and professional, the same shift I remembered from 100 briefing rooms 2 decades earlier. "Talk to me." I laid it out for her exactly as I'd found it. The inflated bond valuation, the shell procurement subsidiary, the materials substitution I'd cross-referenced against public permit filings. I told her the name of the project, the name of the development company, and I told her, because there was no way around it, that the lead developer was my own son-in-law. There was a long silence on the line. "You understand what you're asking me to open, if this is real?" "I understand exactly what I'm asking," I said. "I spent 11 years doing this job before I ever picked up a wrench. I wouldn't be calling you over a hunch. Send me everything you have. Public filings only, Robert. Nothing you're not supposed to have access to anymore." "Understood," I said. And I meant it. Whatever anger I was carrying, I wasn't about to build a federal case on evidence that could get thrown out on a technicality because an old man couldn't let go of his badge. Over the following 2 weeks, I became someone I hadn't been in over 20 years. I woke up before dawn and worked the phones to old contacts in the steel fabrication industry, men who remembered me from cases I'd worked back when they were young engineers just starting out, men who now sat in positions where they could quietly confirm that a company like Brackenfield Supply Partners had never once appeared on any legitimate certified distributor list for seismic-grade structural steel in this country. I drove out to the Riverside Landing construction site itself on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing an old hard hat and a high-visibility vest I still had from my contracting days, and I walked the perimeter like a man who belonged there. Because in this country, a 68-year-old man in a hard hat carrying a clipboard is the most invisible person on any job site. Nobody looks twice at him. Nobody asks him a single question. I photographed pallet markings on delivery shipments. I noted mill certification stamps, or the conspicuous absence of them, on steel beams being hoisted into place 40 feet above the ground. Teresa's office moved with a patience that tested every ounce of restraint I had left. Federal financial crimes cases do not move at the speed of a man's fear for his family's safety. They move at the speed of warrants and subpoenas and careful documentation that will survive a defense attorney's every objection. I understood that pace intellectually. Emotionally, every single day that passed with that building rising higher into the sky felt like watching a slow-motion collision. I was powerless to stop fast enough. It was on a Wednesday evening, exactly 19 days after Claire had asked me not to come to the gala, that I found the detail that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. I had pulled the structural engineering stamp from the publicly filed permit documents, the official seal certifying that a licensed structural engineer had reviewed and approved the seismic bracing design for Riverside Landing's central support core. I recognized the signature style immediately, the particular loop in the capital R, the way the license number was underlined twice instead of once. It belonged to a man I had once helped put behind bars for 2.5 years, back when I was still active in the field, for falsifying inspection reports on a bridge project in another state. His license should have been permanently revoked. Instead, here he was, 14 years later, 3,000 miles away, signing off on the safety of a 42-story tower that hundreds of families were preparing to move their lives into. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a financial fraud case and started understanding it, with total clarity, as a matter of life and death. I called Teresa that night, and for the first time in our 15-year silence, I heard real urgency crack through her professional composure. "Send me his name." Send me everything, right now, tonight. Within 48 hours, her office had coordinated with state licensing boards, the city's building department, and federal prosecutors, and a formal investigation into Riverside Landing's structural certifications was officially opened, quietly, without a single press release, exactly the way these things need to begin, if you don't want the evidence to disappear before the doors get kicked in. I did not call Claire during any of this. I did not call Marcus. I did not attend Ellis Whitfield's retirement gala, obviously, since I hadn't been invited, but I found myself, on the night of the 25th, sitting alone in my garage working on that Mustang, wondering if somewhere across town, in a ballroom full of investors and city officials, my son-in-law was raising a glass and toasting a future that federal agents were already quietly building a case to demolish. 6 weeks after that phone call from Claire that started all of this, the warrants were finally ready. I learned later, from the news reports, like everyone else in this city, that federal agents and city building inspectors arrived at the Riverside Landing construction site at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, alongside representatives from the State Engineering Licensing Board. Construction was halted immediately. Independent structural engineers were brought in within days to conduct an emergency assessment of every steel connection point already installed in the tower's rising frame, and what they found confirmed everything I had traced from that kitchen table folder to that construction site perimeter. The building, as constructed, would not have withstood a moderate seismic event. It would have withstood normal daily loads for years, possibly a decade, lulling everyone into confidence before a genuine stress event exposed the truth in the worst possible way. Marcus Whitfield was named in the federal indictment 3 days later, along with 2 senior partners at Whitfield Development and the disgraced structural engineer whose signature I'd recognized. The financial trail Teresa's team had built showed that Brackenfield Supply Partners had funneled over $11 million in the price difference between certified and substituted materials directly into a network of accounts, controlled by Marcus and his father Ellis, money that had paid for the very penthouse where that retirement gala had been held, for the yacht Ellis kept docked 2 states away, for a lifestyle built, quite literally, on a foundation that could not hold its own weight. That was the night my phone rang at midnight. Claire's voice was shaking so badly I almost couldn't understand her at first. "Dad," she said. "Dad, why is Marcus's name on every news channel in the state? They're saying people could have died. They're saying the building could have collapsed. Dad, please, I don't understand any of this. I need you. Can you come over, please?" I want to tell you honestly, in this moment, sitting here now telling you this story, that I did not feel triumph. I did not feel the satisfaction of a man whose family had finally been punished for looking through him for 6 years. What I felt, driving across town at 1 in the morning to sit with my daughter while her entire constructed world came apart around her, was something closer to grief. Grief for the years I'd spent letting her believe her father was a simple man with simple hands and nothing else worth knowing. Grief for the version of Marcus who might have been capable of building something honest if greed and his father's example hadn't hollowed him out first. And underneath all of it, a quiet, exhausted relief. The kind I imagine a surgeon feels stepping back from a table after cutting out something malignant before it had the chance to spread any further. I sat with Claire until the sun came up that morning. I did not lecture her. I did not say I told you so, because I hadn't told her so. Not once, not ever. In 6 years of watching her slowly disappear into a family that valued the appearance of success over the substance of it, I simply held her hand at her own kitchen table, the same kind of table where I'd first seen that folder, and I let her cry until she had nothing left. And then I made her a pot of coffee the way her mother used to make it, and I told her the truth about who I used to be, all of it, for the very first time in her life. It has been 8 months now since that night. Marcus took a plea agreement rather than face trial, which spared Claire the ordeal of testifying, though it did not spare her the divorce proceedings that followed, or the sale of the house, or the slow, humbling process of rebuilding a life around honest work instead of borrowed wealth. She works now as a project coordinator for a nonprofit that provides emergency housing repairs to elderly residents on fixed incomes, a job she took, she told me, because she wanted to spend her days building something that actually helped people instead of standing next to something that only looked impressive from the street. Ellis Whitfield's case is still working its way through the courts. Riverside Landing itself was fully demolished 4 months ago. The site cleared down to bare ground, and the city has since approved a new development in its place, One being built by a firm with an unimpeachable safety record, using materials that are inspected, certified, and verified at every single stage. I drove past that empty lot last week on my way to the hardware store, and I sat there in my truck for a few minutes, just looking at that flat, quiet ground where 42 stories of lies used to reach up into the sky. Claire came by my place this past Sunday. She sat at my kitchen table in a paint-stained sweatshirt, helping me sort through parts for the Mustang, and she asked me, quietly, why I never told her about the years before the wrenches and the pipe fittings. I told her the same thing I'm telling you now. I told her that for a long time, I thought being underestimated was a burden I simply had to carry, a price you pay for choosing a quiet life after a loud one. But sitting in that garage with my daughter, both of us with grease on our hands for entirely different reasons, I finally understood that being underestimated isn't a weakness at all. It's the one advantage nobody can ever plan around, because the people who look right through you never see what's coming until it's already arrived. A life built on borrowed shine will always eventually meet the weight it was never built to hold. And a man who spends his days quietly, honestly, with his hands doing real work, is never quite as invisible as the people around him would like to believe. So let me ask you this, the same question I've been asking myself every single morning since that phone call at midnight. Who in your life have you stopped truly seeing simply because they never asked you to look?